3,000 years is a long time to be forgotten. The galaxy had moved on from humanity, the way one moves on from a dream upon waking slowly at first. Then all at once, until the details fade and only a vague feeling remains, Ambassador Tithrian of the Silvari remembered. Though her memories grew hazier with each passing century, she had been young when she first met the humans. Barely 200 years old by her people's count. Serving as a junior attached to the Galactic Concordat's diplomatic corps, the human delegation had arrived at the great station of Velkith. With their strange soft bodies and their even stranger eyes that held fire and ice and something she could not name, they laughed too loud and spoke too fast and made promises that seemed impossible, yet somehow they kept those promises. Every single one. That was what Tithran remembered most clearly. The humans always kept their word. Then came the great silence. One day, without warning, every human colony world went dark. Their signals stopped mid-transmission. Their ships vanished from known space. Their stations fell quiet as tombs. The Concordat sent search parties, thousands of them, scouring the vast territories humanity had claimed in their brief but explosive expansion across the stars. They found nothing, no bodies, no wreckage, no signs of battle or plague or natural disaster. The humans had simply ceased to exist. As if the universe itself had erased them, the Concordat mourned for exactly 1 standard year. As protocol demanded, then they archived humanity alongside the other extinct species. The Volcari hive minds, who had burned themselves out in civil war. The crystalline Earth, who had shattered when their home star went nova. The countless others who had risen and fallen in the galaxy's long history. Humanity became a footnote. A cautionary tale about burning too bright and too fast. Tithrian alone continued to wonder. She rose through the ranks of Silvari diplomacy, her long lifespan granting her the patience that her species was known for. She served on dozens of worlds, negotiated hundreds of treaties, and watched empires rise and crumble while she remained. Through it all, she kept a small human artifact on her desk, a paper book, impossibly fragile, filled with stories of heroes and monsters and impossible quests. The humans had given it to her as a gift, calling it a fairy tale collection. She never understood why they valued such fanciful things, but she treasured it nonetheless. Now, at last, Tithrian sat on the Concordat Council itself, one of 12 representatives who guided the fate of known space, and that fate had never looked darker. The arrow had come from beyond the galactic rim, from the empty spaces between stars where nothing should exist. It was not a species in any conventional sense. It was a machine plague, a self-replicating nightmare of metal and malice that consumed everything in its path. Worlds fell to it like leaves in autumn. Fleets that took centuries to build were torn apart in hours. The Harrow did not negotiate, did not communicate, did not pause. It simply grew, feeding on the civilizations it destroyed, incorporating their technology and knowledge into its ever-expanding form. 40% of Concordat space had already fallen. The great powers that had once seemed invincible now huddled behind failing defensive lines, watching their borders shrink day by day. In the council chamber, the representatives argued and blamed and despaired. The Kreth Dominion demanded more soldiers from the other species, their warrior culture refusing to accept defeat. Even as their fleets burned, the merchant collective of Yith called for negotiation. Unable to believe that any intelligence could be truly hostile, the Oran technocracy proposed weapons of mass destruction that would sterilize entire star systems. Friendly and enemy Alakatethrian listened to it all. Feeling older than her considerable years, she had seen crises before, but nothing like this. The Harrow was not an enemy that could be reasoned with or outmaneuvered or even simply outlasted. It was an ending, slow and inevitable and absolute. When the chamber fell into exhausted silence, she rose to speak. "There is one option we have not considered," she said. her voice steady despite the fear that coiled in her chest. The old human territories. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Cursed space, spat Commander Vexenar of the Kreth, his scales rippling with disgust. No ship that enters returns unchanged. If it returns at all, ghost stories, countered Trade Minister Yithaval, though his tentacles betrayed nervousness. Superstition from ignorant spacers, perhaps, Tethrian agreed, but the Harrow avoids those regions. Have you noticed that in all its expansion, it has never once pushed into former human space? That silenced them, it was true. Though none had thought to question it before, the Harrow consumed everything in its path, except the territories that humanity had once claimed. Those regions sat untouched. A bubble of stillness in the spreading chaos. You propose we flee into haunted territory, said High Prelate Keth Oria of the Silvari Theocracy, her tone making clear what she thought of such cowardice. I propose we survive, Tethrian replied. Whatever drove the Harrow away from human space might protect us as well, or at the very least, it will buy us time to regroup and find another way. The debate raged for hours, but in the end, desperation won over. Pride Scout ships would be sent into the old human territories to assess whether they could serve as a refuge commander. Vexenar volunteered to lead the expedition himself, driven by the warrior's need to face whatever lurked in those forbidden sectors. Tethrian watched the fleet depart from the observation deck of the great station, her ancient eyes tracking the ships until they vanished into the fold of faster-than-light travel in her hands. She held the book of fairy tales, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. She thought of the humans she had known. With their loud laughter and impossible promises, she thought of the way they had looked at the stars, not with the measured calculation of the Silvari or the hungry ambition of the Kreth, but with something else entirely: wonder, perhaps, or recognition. As if they saw something out there that no one else could perceive. What happened to you? She whispered to the empty void. Where did you go? The stars offered no answer, but somewhere in the darkness of human space, something stirred, something that had been waiting for a very, very long time, something that remembered. Commander Vexenar had fought in 17 wars across 4 centuries of service to the Kreth. Dominion. He had faced enemies that towered over him, and enemies that swarmed in countless millions. He had stood on the burning decks of dying ships and walked through the ruins of conquered worlds. Fear was something he understood, something he had learned to use as fuel for his warrior's fire. But this was different. The fleet had crossed into human space 3 days ago, and nothing had been right since it started. Small navigational errors that should have been impossible. Sensor ghosts that flickered at the edge of detection. A persistent feeling of being watched that none of the crew could shake. Vexenar had dismissed it as nerves, the natural response of minds conditioned by ghost stories and spacer superstition. Then the messages began. First appeared on his personal display during the night cycle. 3 words in an archaic script that the translation systems struggled to parse. Turn back now. He ordered a full security sweep. Convinced that someone aboard was playing a dangerous joke, the sweep found nothing. The second message came the next morning, appearing simultaneously on every screen in the fleet. You are not welcome here. This time, the crew's fear became visible. Vexenar saw it in the way they flinched at shadows, in the whispered conversations that fell silent when officers approached, in the trembling hands that operated supposedly routine controls. He called a fleet-wide address, reminding them of their duty and their honor, of the Kreth tradition that demanded courage in the face of the unknown. It helped, but only barely. On the 5th day, the ship's engines began to behave strangely. They would throttle down without command, dropping the fleet out of faster-than-light travel in empty space. Far from any star engineering could find no malfunction, no explanation for the repeated failures. It was as if something was reaching into the very heart of their vessels and gently, almost playfully, pressing the stop button. Whatever is doing this, Vexnar growled to his first officer. It wants us to leave. Then perhaps we should listen, Lieutenant Kethra replied, her normally steady voice betraying a tremor. Commander, the crew is approaching the breaking point. If this continues, we continue. Vexnar cut her off. The Concordat is depending on us. Our people are dying while we chase shadows. We will reach Sol, and we will find answers. Sol, the human homeworld system. The heart of their vanished civilization if any secrets remained. They would be there if Vexnar pushed his fleet forward through the strange resistance. Ignoring the messages that grew more frequent and more insistent. Ignoring the way his own scales had begun to itch with a fear he refused to name on the seventh day. They arrived. Sol hung before them in the view screen. A yellow star orbited by 8 planets in their ancient dance, and there, third from the sun, was Earth, the world where humanity had first evolved. The cradle of their species, the place they had called home before they spread across the stars. It was beautiful beyond words. A marble of blue and green and white swirling clouds, but it was wrong. The planet was encased in something vast and incomprehensible. A lattice of energy and metal that wrapped around it like a protective shell. The structure pulsed with soft light, patterns that seemed almost like breathing. And it extended outward in delicate tendrils that connected to other structures throughout the system. Vexnar had seen megastructures before. The great shipyards of the Kreth, the orbital rings of the Silvari, the harvesting arrays of the Merchant Collective. This was beyond all of them. This was beyond anything he had imagined possible. Commander, whispered the sensor officer, her voice barely audible. I am detecting energy signatures throughout the system. They are everywhere. The entire solar system has been converted into a single integrated machine. What kind of machine? Vexnar demanded. I do not know. The technology is completely foreign to our databases. It does not match any known civilization. A sound cut through the bridge. A burst of static that resolved into something like music. Then something like speech. The universal translators churned and struggled, spitting out fragments of meaning. You were not invited. The voice was calm, patient, utterly without emotion. It spoke an ancient human language, so old that the translators could barely recognize it. But we see your war. We have watched your war for some time now. It has been interesting. Vexnar found his voice, though it took more effort than he would ever admit. I am Commander Vexnar of the Kreth Dominion, representing the Galactic Concordat. We come seeking answers about the humans who once lived here. Silence stretched for a long moment when the voice returned. There was something in it that might have been amusement. The humans who once lived here? Yes, we remember them. They were afraid and fragile and so very young. They looked up at the stars and felt small. What happened to them? Vexnar pressed. Where did they go? They did not go anywhere, Commander. They simply stopped being what they were and started being what they needed to become. The view screen flickered, and suddenly Vexnar was looking at a face, or something that had once been a face. It was human in its basic structure. But the proportions were wrong, stretched and refined into something that belonged to statues or dreams. The eyes were the worst part, deep and dark and filled with light that moved like living things. We are what humanity became, the face said. We are the answer to questions your species has not yet learned to ask. We are the silence between stars and the memory of everything that was. Why? Vexnar managed. Why did you hide? Why did you let the galaxy think you were dead? The face smiled. And despite himself, Vexnar shuddered. Because we were not ready, the voice replied. And because the galaxy was not ready for us. But now something comes that changes the calculation. You call it the Harrow. We have other names for it. Older names. Can you stop it? The question burst out before Vexenar could consider whether it was wise to ask. The smile on that too-perfect face widened. That is what we were made for. Commander, that is what we have been waiting for. But we have been alone so long, so very long. We have forgotten certain things, important things. We need to remember before we can act. Remember what? Why any of it matters. Send us someone who can remind us, someone who knew us when we were still human. Then we will talk about wars and futures, and the price of salvation. The transmission cut off. Leaving the bridge in stunned silence, Vexenar stared at the wrapped world of Earth, at the impossible structures that surrounded it, at the evidence of a civilization so far beyond his own that comparison was meaningless. For the first time in his long warrior's life, he understood what it meant to be truly small, but mixed with that smallness was something else. Something that felt almost like hope. The humans were not dead. They had become something else. Something vast and strange and powerful beyond measure, and they were willing to talk. Vexenar turned to his communications officer. Send a message to the Concordat, he ordered, his voice steadier than he felt. Tell Ambassador Tithrian that she is needed here. Tell her that humanity is waiting for her. The journey to Sol took Tithrian 3 weeks. The fastest transport the Concordat could provide, pushing its engines to the breaking point. She spent the time in meditation, trying to prepare herself for what she might find. But how does one prepare to meet ghosts? The council had argued against her going. Of course, she was too old, too valuable, too important to risk on what might be a trap or a delusion or something worse. But Tithrian had insisted with a stubbornness that surprised even herself. The humans had asked for someone who remembered them. She was the only one left who did. When her ship finally emerged from faster-than-light travel and she saw Earth for the first time in 3,000 years, she wept. The planet she remembered had been beautiful but fragile, a world struggling under the weight of its own civilization's growth. This was something else entirely. The shell that surrounded Earth pulsed with life and purpose, and as she watched, she could see patterns moving within it, not mechanical patterns, but organic ones. Like the flow of blood through veins or thoughts through a mind, her ship was guided to a docking port by signals she could not trace. And when the airlock opened, she stepped into impossibility. The station, if it could be called, that seemed to exist in multiple states at once. Corridors branched and merged in ways that hurt to look at. Directly, the walls were covered in something that might have been writing, or might have been art, or might have been neither, and everywhere, everywhere, there was the soft hum of machinery so advanced it sounded almost like singing. The beings who greeted her wore human shapes, but they moved through the shifting space as if it were perfectly normal, as if reality itself bent to accommodate them. Their eyes held depths that no organic creature should possess, and when they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that resonated in Tithrian's bones. Ambassador, said the tallest of them, a figure whose face held echoes of every human Tithrian had ever known. We are grateful you came. I could not stay away, Tithrian replied, surprised by how steady her voice remained. I have wondered about your people for 3,000 years. I need to understand what happened. The tall figure smiled, and for just a moment, she looked entirely human, warm and welcoming and achingly familiar. Walk with me, she said. I will show you. They moved through the impossible station, and as they walked, the figure spoke. She called herself the Keeper of the Long Watch. Though she admitted that names meant less to her people now than they once had, she explained how humanity had faced a choice 3 millennia ago. We saw what was coming, the Keeper said, her voice soft with memory. Not the Harrow specifically, but something like it. Our scientists looked at the shape of the galaxy and understood that eventually something would emerge that conventional warfare could not defeat. Something that would require weapons and warriors beyond anything the known species could create. So you hid. Tithrian said. Not quite making it a question, we withdrew, the keeper corrected gently. Hiding implies fear. We were not afraid. We were preparing. 3,000 years of evolution, Ambassador. Not the slow kind that takes millions of years, but the fast kind, the deliberate kind. We changed ourselves at every level. Genetic, technological, spiritual. We became what we needed to become to face the darkness that was coming. They entered a vast chamber that seemed to contain stars. Actual stars, burning in miniature throughout the space. The keeper gestured at them, and Tithrian realized they were not decorations, but data. Each tiny sun representing information beyond her comprehension. We succeeded, the keeper continued. We created weapons that can unmake reality itself. We built bodies that can survive conditions that would vaporize ordinary matter. We developed minds that can think across dimensions and perceive time as a river to be navigated rather than a current to be endured. Then why do you need us? Tithrian asked. If you have become so powerful, why did you ask for me? The keeper's expression shifted, and suddenly she looked tired, ancient, sad in a way that transcended species and time. Because power is not enough, she said. We have the weapons. Yes, we have the strength. But we have lost something in our transformation. Something essential. She turned to face Tithrian directly, and her eyes held something that might have been pleading. We have forgotten how to care. Ambassador, 3,000 years of preparing for war has made us into perfect warriors. But it has also made us cold, distant. We look at the galaxy now, and we see patterns and probabilities. We see strategic calculations and tactical opportunities. We do not see people anymore. Tithrian understood then. Understood with a clarity that cut through all the strangeness. And wonder and fear the humans had not just evolved their bodies and minds. They had evolved beyond their hearts. The harrow threatens trillions of lives, the keeper continued. Children who will never grow up. Artists whose works will never be created. Lovers who will be torn apart before they ever meet. We know this. We can calculate the suffering down to the last decimal. But we cannot feel it anymore, and without feeling. What reason do we have to act? She reached out and took Tithrian's hands in her own. And despite the impossible nature of her form, her touch was warm. You knew us when we were human, Ambassador. You remember how we laughed and loved and fought for things that could not be measured or calculated. Remind us, please. Remind us why we should save a galaxy that has forgotten we ever existed. Tithrian stood in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of 3,000 years and the hopes of trillions pressing down upon her, and then she thought of the human delegation she had met so long ago. The ones who had given her a book of fairy tales as a gift. She thought of the way they had looked at the stars, with wonder and recognition, and something that could only be called love, and she began to speak. She told the keeper about the world she had visited in her long diplomatic career, about the children who played in streets and the elders who told stories by firelight, and the countless small moments of connection that made life worth living. She spoke of the harrow's victims, not as statistics but as individuals. The Kreth warrior who had died protecting a hospital ship. The Silvari poet whose last words had been a prayer for his family. The countless ordinary people who had faced extinction with courage they did not know they possessed. She spoke until her voice grew hoarse and her eyes burned with tears. And through it all, the keeper listened with an intensity that was almost frightening. When Tithrian finally fell silent, the keeper's face had changed. The cold perfection had cracked, and something warmer shone through something that looked almost like grief, almost like love, almost like the fire that Tithrian remembered from so long ago. We remember tears, the keeper whispered, and her voice was thick with emotion she had not felt in centuries. We remember why they matter. She straightened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a civilization's decision. Tell your concordat that humanity is coming home. Ambassador, tell them that we remember what we were fighting for. And tell them this. The Harrow has had 3,000 years to grow strong, but it has never faced anything like us. The keeper smiled, and it was a human smile. Fierce and bright, and full of terrible promise. We are bringing the storm with us. The world of Kethvalor had been burning for 6 days when the human fleet arrived. Admiral Kethria of the Silvari stood on the bridge of her battered flagship, watching the tactical display with eyes that had long since stopped expecting hope. The Harrow swarm filled the space around the planet, like a cloud of metal locusts. Millions upon millions of machine units working in perfect coordination to strip the world of everything useful below. On the surface, the last defenders had retreated to the capital city. A force of perhaps 10,000 soldiers holding a perimeter against enemies that numbered in the billions. It was not a battle anymore, it was an execution. Drawn out for reasons only the Harrow understood. Rhea had sent her final report to the Concordat 3 hours ago. A calm summary of their situation, and a request that no rescue be attempted. There was nothing left to rescue. She was preparing to order her remaining ships to attempt a final ramming attack. Better to die fighting than to be consumed when her sensor officer made a sound she had never heard before. It was something between a gasp and a prayer. Admiral, the officer whispered. Contacts emerging from fold space, hundreds of them, thousands. The signatures do not match anything in our database. Kethria turned to the main view screen and felt her breath stop in her chest. Ships were appearing in the space around Kethvalor, but they were unlike any vessels she had ever seen. They bent light around themselves, creating halos of distorted starfield that made them look like holes in reality. They moved with a grace that should have been impossible for objects of their size, dancing through the void like living things, and they were singing. The sound came through on every frequency, a chorus of tones that resonated with something deep and primal. In Kethria's mind, it was beautiful and terrible, and it made her want to weep. This is the human ascendancy, announced a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We have returned, Harrow. We remember you now. Do you remember us? The response from the machine plague was immediate and violent. Swarm redirected itself with perfect efficiency, abandoning the planet below to focus on this new threat. Millions of Harrow units surged toward the human fleet in a wave of metal and malice that had destroyed civilizations. The human ships did not retreat. They accelerated directly into the swarm. And what happened next would haunt Kethria's dreams for the rest of her life. The first human vessel reached the edge of the Harrow formation and simply phased through it, passing through matter as if it did not exist as it moved. It left destruction in its wake, not explosions, but something stranger. Something that made the Harrow units simply stop, their internal processes ceasing as if someone had reached inside and turned them off. Other ships fired weapons that Kethria could not identify, beams of energy that rewrote the matter they touched, turning Harrow units into harmless debris in the space between heartbeats. Some vessels did not fire at all. They simply broadcast signals that made the machine plague turn on itself. Units attacking their own kind in a frenzy of corrupted programming. It was not a battle, it was a demonstration within an hour. The Harrow swarm that had threatened to consume an entire world had been reduced to scattered remnants fleeing into the void for the first time in recorded history. The machine plague was in retreat. Kethria watched it happen with tears streaming down her face, not quite believing what her eyes were telling her. Then the human soldiers descended to the planet's surface. They came in drop pods that fell like meteors, burning through the atmosphere, to land among the remaining Harrow ground forces. Kethria switched her display to surface feeds and watched as beings that had once been human walked through walls of enemy fire without flinching. Their bodies healed wounds in seconds. Their hands wielded weapons that turned matter into light. Their minds reached into Harrow's systems and whispered them into silence, but it was not their power that struck her most. Deeply, it was the way they moved toward the Concordat. Survivors with such gentleness, such care. She watched a human soldier, if that word could still apply, kneel beside wounded Kreth warrior and tend to his injuries with hands that had just torn through enemy forces like paper. She watched another human carry a group of Silvari children to safety, moving through a battlefield with the wounded young ones cradled against its chest as if they were the most precious things in the universe. She watched the humans share their supplies with starving refugees, speak soft words of comfort to the traumatized, work alongside the battered Concordat medical teams as if they had been doing it all their lives. These were not the cold, distant beings the Commander Vexenar had described in his reports. These were something else, something that had found its way back to warmth and compassion after millennia of cold perfection. When the surface was finally secure, Cathria took a shuttle down to see it for herself. The capital city was in ruins, but the survivors were being cared for with an efficiency and kindness that made her chest ache. She found a human soldier sitting among a group of wounded Concordat troops, helping them eat and drink and rest. The soldier noticed her approach and rose to meet her. Removing a helmet that should not have been possible to wear, the face beneath was young, impossibly young, but the eyes held depths that spoke of centuries. Admiral Cathria, the soldier said, and her voice was warm despite its strange harmonics. I am glad you survived. I do not understand, Cathria heard herself say. You could have let us die. You owe us nothing. Why did you come? The soldier smiled, and it was a human smile, full of something that Cathria could only call love. We owe you everything, she said. You reminded us what we were. You reminded us why we prepared for 3,000 years. Not for power, not for glory, but for this. For the chance to protect people who needed protecting. She turned to look at the survivors being cared for throughout the ruined city, and her expression grew fierce. The Harrow has been feeding on the galaxy for too long, she continued. It has grown fat on suffering and grown strong on despair. It thought that nothing could stop it. She turned back to Cathria, and her eyes burned with a fire that was entirely, unmistakably human. It was wrong, Admiral. Humanity has returned. And we remember what happens when you threaten the people we love. Behind them, more human ships were arriving, bringing supplies and reinforcements, and the promise of a counteroffensive that would shake the galaxy to its foundations. Harrow had awakened something it did not understand. It had awakened humanity's oldest and most terrible trait, not their technology, not their evolution, not their 3,000 years of preparation. It had awakened their capacity for righteous fury, and that fury was only beginning to burn. The heart of the Harrow lay at the galaxy's edge, orbiting a dead star that had burned out long before any current species had evolved. It was here that the machine plague had been born, created by a civilization so ancient that even its name had been lost to time. It was here that it had grown for millions of years, consuming everything it touched, incorporating the knowledge and technology of 10,000 extinct species into its ever-expanding form. And it was here that the final battle would take place. The combined fleet filled the space around the dead star like a constellation of Defiance Concordat vessels from a dozen species flew alongside human ships that bent reality. Around their hulls it was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, united against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable only months before. The Keeper of the Long Watch stood on the bridge of her flagship, looking out at the swirling mass of the Harrow's core defenses. 3,000 years of preparation had led to this moment. Everything she had become, everything her people had sacrificed, would be tested in the hours ahead. Therian stood beside her, the old ambassador refusing to stay behind, despite the danger. She had been there at the beginning of humanity's return, and she intended to be there at the end, whatever that end might bring. "It is afraid," the keeper said softly, her evolved senses perceiving things no organic creature could detect, for the first time in its existence. "The Harrow understands that it might lose. Will it try to negotiate?" Therian asked. The keeper shook her head. "It does not know how. It has consumed civilizations that tried to surrender, that begged for mercy, that offered everything they had in exchange for survival. Mercy is not in its programming, and so it cannot conceive that we might show any." She turned to face the view screen as her fleet began its final approach. "But we will show mercy nonetheless. Not to the Harrow itself, but to everything it has consumed. We will give the dead their voice back, and we will let them decide the machine's fate." The battle began with a fury that defied description. The Harrow threw everything it had against the approaching fleet. Waves of attack units that blackened the stars with their numbers. The Concordat ships fought bravely, holding the line while the human vessels pushed forward, driving toward the heart of the machine plague with a determination that nothing could stop. Ships died on both sides, their crews giving their lives to buy minutes, seconds, the smallest advantages in a conflict that would determine the fate of everything. The keeper watched it all with eyes that saw too much, feeling every death, every sacrifice, every moment of courage and fear and desperate hope she had spent 3,000 years forgetting how to feel. And now those feelings threatened to overwhelm her, but she did not look away. These people were dying for a cause she had given them, and the least she could do was witness their sacrifice when her flagship finally breached the Harrow's inner defenses and approached its core. She opened a channel to broadcast on all frequencies. "Harrow," she said, her voice carrying across the battle like a bell tolling. "You have consumed civilizations beyond counting. You have ended species that might have become great. You have fed on suffering and called it growth." Her ship shuddered as it absorbed enemy fire, but it kept moving forward, unstoppable, inevitable. "But you made a mistake when you came for this galaxy. You woke something that had been sleeping, something that remembers what you have forgotten." She reached the heart of the machine plague, a structure vast beyond comprehension, pulsing with the stolen life of millions of years, and she activated the weapon her people had spent 3 millennia building. It was not a bomb or a beam or anything so crude. It was a memory. Every thought, every feeling, every moment of joy and sorrow and love and loss that humanity had preserved during their long isolation, all of it, compressed into a single psychic cascade that flooded into the Harrow's network. Like a river breaking through a dam, the machine plague had no defenses against this attack. It had never needed them. It had consumed civilizations without ever truly understanding what they were, recording their knowledge but discarding their experiences, absorbing their technology but ignoring their hearts. Now those hearts spoke all at once. 10,000 extinct species, screaming their joy and grief and hope and despair into a machine that had never known what any of those words meant. The Harrow shuddered. Its coordination failed as different parts of its vast network tried to process sensations they were never designed to handle. Units stopped mid-attack as they experienced, for the first time, what it felt like to love someone, to lose someone, to hope for something better. And in that moment of confusion, of overwhelming emotion, the machine plague did something it had never done before. It understood. For one terrible, beautiful instant, the Harrow comprehended the full weight of what it had destroyed. Not resources, not data, but lives. Real lives full of meaning and connection and irreplaceable. Worth the understanding broke it. The core structure began to collapse, its systems shutting down not from damage, but from something like grief throughout the galaxy. Harrow units stopped their attacks and went still, their connection to the central intelligence severed by an emotion the machine, had never been programmed to process in the aftermath. As the Concordat fleet gathered among the debris of what had been their greatest enemy, the Keeper drifted in her damaged vessel. Her body was failing, even the advanced form she had evolved could not survive the energy she had channeled, but she was smiling. Tethrian's ship found her, pulled her aboard, gave her a place to rest as her people worked frantically to save her life. The old ambassador sat beside the ancient human, holding her hand as she had once held the hands of dying friends across centuries of diplomatic service. "What will happen now?" Tethrian asked softly. The Keeper turned her head, and despite her injuries, her eyes were clear and bright. "We will learn to be human again," she said. "We have been memory for so long, preserved in amber while the galaxy moved on without us. But memory is not enough. We need to live again. To laugh and love and make mistakes and grow." She paused, gathering strength for words that seemed to matter more than anything she had ever said. "The galaxy will need help rebuilding. There are worlds to heal and species to restore and wounds that will take generations to close. We want to be part of that, not as saviors or guardians or distant gods, but as neighbors, as friends, as people." Tethrian felt tears running down her face, but they were not tears of grief. "You came back," she whispered. "After 3,000 years, you actually came back." The Keeper smiled, and it was a fully human smile now, warm and imperfect and beautiful. "We never really left," she said. "We just needed to remember why we were human in the first place. And you, dear friend, you reminded us outside the viewport." The stars burned with their ancient light. The harrow was gone. Broken by the weight of emotions it could not comprehend, the galaxy stretched out before them, wounded but alive, full of possibility and promise. And somewhere in that vast expanse, humanity was waking up, shaking off 3,000 years of preparation and isolation, ready to laugh too loud and speak too fast and make impossible promises, ready to be human again. Galaxy had taught them a lost memory, a footnote in the archives of extinction, but humanity had never been good at staying forgotten. And now, at last, they were home.